the main question we face, I remember in Addis Ababa a couple of years ago at the conference where the Sustainable Development Goals were largely discussed and adopted was, yeah, but what is important too, and maybe more important, is the way the rights to tax are shared between countries, and the time where you had a small club of rich countries, namely the OECD, telling the rest of the world what to do, has changed. I would say it has indeed changed, because now on tax we no longer have 35 members, but 148 as regards the Global Forum on Transparency, 112. I can make the announcement now publicly. Serbia just joined the inclusive framework this morning. So 112 countries on an equal footing, but fundamentally the model tax convention of the OECD remains the same. So I'm pretty sure that Allison would have some acute comments on, is BEPS the issue, or is the issue the allocation of taxing rights?
Thank you, Pascal, and thank you for the invitation to be here. The question of allocation is an interesting one because it's both a process question, who should decide how profits should be allocated and how should they decide, and it's a substance question. And I think for the process question, you're quite right to point to the inclusive framework. That's the place where we think a change is coming, or a change is potentially coming, where people with different ideas about how things ought to happen will have a platform to express those ideas. And so it remains to be seen whether the inclusive framework can make that work. Equal footing is a hard thing to do in practice. As you know, we've talked about that, and you're aware of that. And I think that's, there's no way to answer that yet. What does that mean, equal footing, when obviously countries are of different resources and they have different issues? And so there's a process question that I think is really important, and I hope that that's something that will be a focus going forward, because the substance does follow from the process. If we continue in along the path that we've come to date, for 100 years we've had treaties, tax treaties, allocating profits in a certain way, and we never really have articulated what does that affect, when everyone is at the table to discuss what principles were at play. Do we still think we have the right principle? So right now, the way we allocate profits amongst countries effectively is where the productivity is highest. Why do I say that? Because when you tax income where value is created, value has to be calculated. And how do we calculate value? We typically use market prices and market transactions. And so this rewards highly productive countries that can contribute higher value inputs. And that means it systemically deprives lower productivity countries, and that's baked in. But this is not necessary. This is not inevitable, because there's an issue here in the allocation, which is that we have a fiction that a profit, a dollar made in a multinational trade, can be fragmented, and it can be assigned with economic rigor to different countries based on their relative contributions to the value. But this is a fiction. We all know we can't do that. And so we have made a compromise, and we have the residence and source compromise. But it's a fiction in that the gains, the product, the surplus that we have to divide, the profits from multinationals, arise from the very ability to transact across borders. It's the ability to trade that creates this profit, and that means it doesn't belong to one country or the other, but it's the surplus from the trade. And how is it that we are allocating that along some odd notion about which country has contributed more value? It's because we've always done it that way. And so we continue to think that it makes sense to talk about taxing income where value is created, even though we know that means we reward ourselves, the OECD countries, and we deprive all the other members of the inclusive framework, or many of the other members of the inclusive framework. So this is a problem that I think we should not take for granted, that we know the answer. the surplus gains could be allocated, could be distributed in a different way. For example, where is the revenue most productively assigned? If it's going to go to one country, which is going to build infrastructure on top of an already robust infrastructure, instead of another country where it would go to basic primary education and healthcare and so on, then why would we make a decision that has nothing to do with income, economic value, to allocate it to the richer country? Why won't we make a decision that has nothing to do with economic value and allocate it to the poorer country? There's not really any reason to do that except tradition. We've always done it this way, and we continue to believe in these principles of residence and source and economic fragmentation of corporate profits. So I would like to suggest that there's a platform, the Inclusive Framework, where that kind of question ought to be asked. If what we're doing is a fiction anyway, and I think we all know it is a fiction, transfer pricing is a fiction, and any other method you would use to allocate income across countries, including, by the way, formulary apportionment, would also be a fiction based on an idea about economic inputs, will continue to favor rich countries and allocate more tax to rich countries and less to poor countries. If all those things are based on economic fictions, then how about a different economic fiction, which is where would the money be best spent? And that's where I think we come to this place of aligning tax and the Sustainable Development Goals. We have a pretty clear benchmark here of where the money needs to be spent, and it's not in Canada, and it's not in the United States or the UK or any of my friends in the OECD. That's not where the money is needed most desperately from international, multinational business. So can we have that conversation in the Inclusive Framework? And I think if we are getting there, we have to understand that we have a different mission here, which is this platform for collaboration on taxes telling us that we need to accept that things aren't going to always be the way they always have been, and that we have a way now. Pascal is showing us the way. It's through the Inclusive Framework. And now it's the job of everyone who doesn't think we should be continuing to do it the same way as we've done in the past to take up that offer and use that platform to have a serious discussion about what it is we're doing now and what we could be doing differently. Thank you, Pascal.
Thank you. Quite provocative. Seems to be endorsed by a number of people in the room. From your perspective, and not only an academic perspective, but the platform was established a couple of years ago. I mean, we initiated the discussion in October 2015 to establish it, and then it took a few months to come to terms of reference. What are your expectations? What should be our ambitions in terms of for organizations working together and working with all the other regional tax organizations and organizations involved in international taxation?
Thanks, Pascal. Well, we talked a lot about BEPS, even though you're tired of it. But we didn't talk a whole lot about the SDGs, even though that's really the point of the collaboration. So I guess my challenge question would be, does or will the platform monitor the use of revenues, the spending of revenues that are henceforth protected by BEPS, by the BEPS platform? If not, if the revenues aren't spent to further the aims of the SDGs, and the whole project of BEPS, the coordination, the cooperation with BEPS is to ensure that there's more revenues. But then if it's not aligned with the SDGs, or if that's not where the revenues are going, then what would be the point? So I think that if the platform is not going to monitor the outcomes and the use of the revenues, that makes me wonder what we are going to do, or what you are going to do. Not we, sorry. I have nothing to do with it. It's your project. But what you are going to do with it. And if you are going to peer review, monitor, or so on, if it's going to be folded into that process, what will there be policy learning, and will that be translated into Action 13, measuring and monitoring BEPS going forward, and therefore open up the floor for further refinement of what the goals are in terms of substance?
My question is to Professor Allison. Congratulations to our panelists. Very interesting presentation. I would like to hear more from you when you mentioned that transfer pricing is a fiction. In what sense? It doesn't exist. We are not controlling. We have to review the methods. I think you touched on a very important point, and I'd like to hear from you more.
And I will use my privilege of moderator to ask for a response of 35-second fiction or reality.
I'll send you a paper. The fiction, I think, I'm not even sure that we can say we know what transfer pricing accomplishes, but the fiction that I'm talking about is that it's based on the idea that you can fragment a dollar earned in a multinational enterprise, that you can divide it into pieces and assign it based on which input created it, when we know that the thing that created the dollar is the surplus. The surplus profit is from the transaction itself, the ability to transact in a multinational way. So that's the fiction, but we can talk about that some more, because I think I already got a 35 seconds. But I do have a paper. I'm happy to share that paper. And anybody who wants that, I will pass that along. Sorry, Pascal, I think that was 40 seconds.
Yeah, that was nice and good. As for me, I would invite you to reflect on these French terms, which is transfer pricing are about to oblige companies à jouer à la marchande, which means like kids when they mimic, they go to the market and they try to play. Except that it was an obligation on companies at the beginning, and now it's become a massive opportunities for companies not to pay the taxes where they may pay them. Thank you very much, and please applaud the panel.